Mr. President, it was 1 week ago when President Trump, as well as Attorney General Sessions, announced that they were going to rescind the Daca Program. This is a program created by President Obama by executive order, which allowed those who had come to the United States as children to have an opportunity to be given 2 years on a renewable basis where they would not be subject to deportation and could work. These have been young people known as the Dreamers, a term that came about when I introduced a bill 16 years ago called the DREAM Act. These are young people who, frankly, are just asking for a chance, an opportunity to be part of the only country they've ever known. The laws of the United States are very tough, very strict, and say that if you're undocumented in their situation, you have to leave America for 10 years and then petition to come back in. That's why I introduced the DREAM Act, so these young people who were brought to this country by their parents would have a chance. President Obama used his authority as an executive order to allow them to apply for DACA protection. They had to pay a substantial filing fee and submit themselves to a criminal background check before they would be allowed to stay. 780,000 young people did just that. And they were protected, are protected currently, but only for a few more months under this DACA provision. What's going to happen to them, we don't know. The only thing that makes any sense at this point is for Congress to act, for us to do something to replace the DACA program, which the President is going to rescind, with a law which establishes clearly the requirements as well as the rights that will be given these individuals under the law. That's why I've introduced the DREAM Act. My co-sponsor, Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, 3 other Republican co-sponsors at this point, and we hope to move this forward. President Trump has said he is interested in working with us, and we're going to take him at his word. Despite rescinding DACA, I hope that the President will be on our side to come up with a replacement that is fair. I want to also address many of the myths that have come up about DACA as well as the DREAM Act, and I'm going to quote an unusual source for this senator. The source is a man named David Beyer. David is an immigration policy analyst at the Cato Institute. Now, those of us who live in this Washington environment of politics know that the Cato Institute is not a liberal think tank. The opposite. It's a conservative, largely Republican think tank. And Mr. Beyer has published an article that has been seen in the Washington Post and Chicago Tribune and other papers entitled "The 5 Myths About DACA." In this article, I ask consent that it be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. In this article, he spells out in some detail why some of the myths that were perpetrated by Attorney General Sessions and others last week need to be explained. One of the myths is that DACA somehow incentivized an increase in illegal immigration. Mr. Beyer makes it clear that when it comes down to it, that you cannot arrive in the United States today and expect to be protected by DACA tomorrow. In fact, you have to have arrived in the United States at least by June 15th of 2007, more than a decade ago. So to argue that DACA was an incentive for more immigration to this country is just plain wrong. And what about those kids that showed up at the borders a few years ago, thousands of them? Well, it turns out they weren't eligible for DACA or the DREAM Act. And it also turns out most of them were not from Mexico, but were from parts of Central America that has been devastated by crime waves and gang activity. The second myth, which Mr. Beyer addresses, is that these DACA recipients, 780,000, are taking jobs away from Americans. What he points out is if you start with the premise that we have a static amount of jobs in this country, what he calls a lump of labor fallacy, then it's dog eat dog to fight for those jobs. It turns out that we have an expanding economy, and he proves it by giving us a statistic. Between 1970 and 2017, the U.S. labor force doubled. So rather than ending up with 50% unemployment rate, our U.S. employment doubled. It is an expanding and dynamic economy, and the case can be made, and I think effectively, that the DACA recipients are people who can add to the economy. All of them have to have the equivalent or a high school education. Many of them, large percentages of them, have college degrees and even more. so they can bring a lot to the economy. The other point, the other myth that Mr. Beyer addresses is whether repealing DACA would benefit taxpayers. The point he makes is that these DACA recipients are paying taxes in the jobs that they are working, and by and large are ineligible for any federal programs, any federal assistance. So they are a net gain in terms of our Treasury, in terms of what they can do. For example, if you are protected by DACA today on a 2-year renewable basis, you do not qualify for a Pell Grant to go to college. You don't qualify for a federal government loan. You've got to find out how you're going to do it some other way. So these young people working and paying taxes are not drawing from many of the government programs which other people their age draw from. There's also this argument that DACA somehow is going to make America less safe. There'll be more criminals. Don't forget what I said earlier. To qualify for DACA, you have to submit yourself to a criminal background check. The likelihood of the next crime being committed by a DACA recipient is very narrow. The likelihood that it's committed by someone who is already an American citizen, much more likely. And finally, the argument that DACA is just about politics. Well, it can be about politics unless we do our job in Congress. We're supposed to pass the laws. The president's challenged us to pass a law which will help deal with DACA. We have, I think, an awesome responsibility to do just that. I was at Loyola Medical School on Friday and met several of the DACA students who are in medical school at Loyola. They're extraordinarily bright individuals who competed and were accepted at Loyola Medical School. Now they've got a problem. As they complete the 4 years of Loyola Medical School, they want to apply for residencies so they can specialize. If you're going to be a resident, you better be prepared to work. If you don't have DACA protection, you can't legally work in the United States. 32 aspiring, really bright young medical students, soon to be doctors, will be stopped in their tracks if we don't replace DACA, because they cannot apply for a residency, because they cannot legally work in America without DACA protection or something like it. Would we be better off in America if those 32 individuals did not become doctors? Of course not. We want them to become doctors, and in Illinois, the state's helping to pay for their education with the promise that they will practice medicine in an underserved area of our state. I'm from downstate Illinois, small town Illinois, and I will tell you, we desperately need more doctors, not just in individual towns, but at the hospitals that serve those towns. If these 32 can help us reach those goals, we're going to have better medical care across our state. But that depends on Congress, and Congress meeting its responsibility. I've come to the floor of the Senate over 100 times now to tell the stories of individuals who were affected by DACA and the DREAM Act, and I want to do that again today. I found that speeches are great, statistics are fine, but when you hear the stories about these individuals, who they are, what they've done, and what they aspire to do, you can understand the context of this important national debate. The person I want to introduce today in the Senate is a young lady, Christina Velazquez. She was brought to the United States at the age of 6 from Caracas, Venezuela. She went to elementary school in Madison, Wisconsin. She wrote me a letter. Christina wrote the following. She said, I spent my formative childhood years in the Midwest, where I learned to assimilate, learned the values this country was founded on. The salt of the earth quality of people around me and extraordinary kindness between strangers shaped my own values and attitude toward others. Growing up in Madison taught me a great deal about compassion, patience, and hard work. Christina was an outstanding student. In high school, a member of the National Honor Society. She was elected as vice president of her class and managed the track team. She found time to volunteer at a local summer camp for pre-K students. She graduated from the Honors College at Miami-Dade Community College. She is currently a student at Georgetown University, majoring in international law, institutions, and ethics. She's received the President's Volunteer Service Award 2 years in a row and is a Walsh Scholar. As a graduate of Georgetown, I can tell you, nobody ever named me a Walsh Scholar. This young lady obviously is very talented. During her time at Georgetown, Christina has interned in the U.S. House of Representatives and piloted the college mentorship program at a local high school. In addition, she also has found time to have 2 part-time jobs. Mr. President, she has to. You see, as a person who is protected by DACA and undocumented, she doesn't qualify for government assistance to go to college. certainly not at the federal level. So these students have to work extra hard to stay in school. She's dedicated 2 of her undergraduate summers and a full school year volunteering to teach in Miami and in San Francisco. In both of these cities, she worked with high-achieving, low-income students, trying to get them into college. You see, Christina's dream, ultimately, is to be a teacher. She joined 15 other students from Georgetown in my office last week. They came in as we were debating DACA and the DREAM Act on the floor, and I'm sure they wanted to hear my speech on the floor, but just to make sure, we bought a dozen pizzas, and the crew seemed to be pretty happy with that decision. It was an impressive group of students, every one of them a DACA recipient. These young people have so much potential, but they're worried. They don't know what their future will be with the decision made last week by the Trump administration to repeal DACA. Congress hasn't acted to pass the DREAM Act, and we should. As for Christina Velazquez, she'll graduate from Georgetown in December. She's been accepted into Teach for America. Most of us know that organization well, but for the record, it's a national nonprofit organization that places the most talented recent college graduates in challenging school districts in urban and rural areas where they have a shortage of teachers. Teach for America has 190 teachers working in these challenging districts who are currently DACA dreamers. They are teaching kids all across America. What does it say about us? What does it say to their students if these Teach for America dreamers are invited to leave the country? That's exactly what Mr. Steve Bannon said on 60 Minutes on Sunday when he came out against our efforts to pass the DREAM Act. He wants Christina Velazquez gone. He thinks America's a better place if she's gone. I think he's wrong, and I think most reasonable people would agree. Christina is going to start the program Teach for America next summer and teach next fall, but without DACA or the DREAM Act, Christina and 190 other Teach for America teachers will be forced to drop out and leave their students behind. Instead, many would have them deported back to countries they've never known, saying they're not part of the United States and they don't have anything to offer us. Will America be a stronger country if we deport Christina, or if she stays here to teach children in challenging districts? I think the answer is clear to any reasonable person. When we introduced the DREAM Act, Senator Lindsey Graham and I, Republican of South Carolina, Democrat of Illinois, co-sponsoring the measure, gave a press conference. Senator Graham said, and I quote, "The moment of reckoning is coming." Well, Mr. President, that moment has arrived. Republican leaders in Congress need to help us to pass the DREAM Act once and for all and make it the law of land. We need to bear responsibility for these hundreds of thousands who can make America a better country and show with their lives that the promise of America is still very much alive. As for this United States Senator, I've been at this for a long time. I'm going to see it to the finish line. I still have that dream of the day when President Trump signs the DREAM Act into law in the Oval Office. It'll be a great day, particularly for this country, to recognize that these young people offer a special talents and a special commitment to the future of America, which we desperately need. Mr. President, I yield the floor.